Dalton Hale stood at his kitchen window in the pre-dawn darkness, coffee going cold in his hand, watching his ranch die by degrees. The barn roof sagged like a broken promise. The empty cattle pens told the story of everything he'd already lost. 3 generations of Hales had worked this land, and he was going to be the one who lost it. Movement along the eastern ridge pulled his attention. Riders, 5 or 6 of them, moving in tight formation across his property line with a kind of disciplined precision that made his pulse quicken. They weren't wandering. They had purpose. As they descended the ridge, Dalton could make out details. Apache, dark clothing, weapons sheathed but present. They rode like a war party that had chosen not to fight. Yet, the lead rider dismounted and walked to his fence post with measured steps. A young woman, moving with the quiet authority of someone who expected to be obeyed. She reached into a pouch at her belt, withdrew something small, and placed it carefully on top of the weathered wood. Then she stepped back and looked directly at his window. At him. Dalton's coffee cup slipped from his hand and shattered on the floor. He was moving before he registered the decision, shouldering through the front door and stumbling onto the porch, his eyes locked on what she'd left on the fence post. A bracelet. Small, beaded, child-sized. Red, black, and white stones on leather gone gray with age. He knew it. God, he knew it. His gaze snapped to the woman, and that's when he saw the scars, thin white lines wrapped around her left wrist, disappearing under her sleeve. Old scars. 15 years old. The kind left by teeth and claws. You remember, she said, her voice carrying across the distance with perfect clarity. Not a question. A statement. Dalton's throat closed. He nodded, unable to form words. She stepped closer to the fence, her expression shifting into something more complicated than simple recognition. My name is Iona, she said, and the way she spoke made it clear the name carried weight. Chief Iona of the Red Ridge Apache. She paused, holding his gaze. 15 winters ago, you saved my life. The memory crashed over him, the wolves circling, the small girl covered in blood, her screams cutting through the night. He'd fired his rifle, drove the animals back, carried her broken body to her people. She'd been so small in his arms, the bracelet clutched in her tiny fist even as she lost consciousness. He'd been certain she wouldn't survive. I was 7 years old, Iona continued, touching the scars on her wrist almost absently. I wandered too far from camp. Got separated. The wolves found me before my people did. Her eyes found his again. You found me first. You were dying, Dalton said, his voice rough with a memory. There was so much blood. I didn't think. I lived, she cut him off gently. Because of you. Her expression hardened then, something fierce moving behind her eyes. I have carried that debt for 15 years, and I have come here to repay it. Relief flooded through Dalton so suddenly it nearly buckled his knees. He'd been drowning for months, bad deals, dried up credit, mounting debts, and here was help from the last direction he'd ever expected. Whatever she was offering, it was more than he had. You don't owe me anything, he said, though the words felt hollow. I just did what anyone would. You misunderstand, Iona interrupted, and something in her tone made the relief drain away as quickly as it had come. Her jaw tightened. I am not here because I want to repay you. I am here because I have to. She stepped right up to the fence now, close enough that he could see the weight in her dark eyes, the certainty of someone who knew things he didn't. Behind her, the mounted riders shifted, and Dalton suddenly realized they weren't facing him. They were facing outward, watching the tree line in the road with the alertness of sentries expecting trouble. I arrived just in time, Iona said, her voice dropping lower, sharper. Before they take the last thing you have left. The words hung in the cold morning air like a blade. Dalton felt ice spread through his chest. What? Whose? We need to talk, Iona said, cutting him off. Now. The memory came back to Dalton in fragments, the way trauma always does, not as a smooth narrative but as flashes of sensation and sound that his mind had tried for years to bury. It had been a different kind of winter back then, 15 years ago, when the ranch still had enough cattle to feel like a working operation and the debts were manageable if not comfortable. He'd been younger then, stronger, still carrying some of the optimism his father had tried to beat into him about the land taking care of those who took care of it. That optimism was already starting to crack, but it hadn't shattered yet. The blizzard had come down hard that night, the kind of storm that turned the world into a wall of white noise and made you question whether anything existed beyond your own four walls. Dalton had been in his cabin, feeding the fire and listening to the wind scream around the eaves, when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the storm. It was distant, almost swallowed by the howling wind, but it cut through anyway. A scream. Human. Young. He could have convinced himself it was nothing. The wind playing tricks, an animal caught in a trap, his imagination conjuring ghosts in the storm. He could have stayed by the fire, poured another whiskey, and told himself that whatever was out there wasn't his problem. The smart thing, the safe thing, would have been to wait until morning when the storm broke and someone else could deal with it. Instead, he'd pulled on his heaviest coat, grabbed his rifle, and walked out into a night that wanted to kill him. The snow had been so thick he could barely see his own hands. The cold bit through every layer he wore, turning his fingers numb within minutes. He'd followed the sound more by instinct than by any real sense of direction, pushing through drifts that came up to his knees, his horse refusing to go any further after the first quarter-mile. So he'd gone on foot, the rifle slung across his back, following screams that kept getting weaker and more desperate until they finally led him to a ravine on the edge of his property where the rocks formed a natural shelter. What he found there would stay with him for the rest of his life. 2 children, Apache by their clothing, huddled against the rock face. A boy and a girl, neither of them older than 10. The boy wasn't moving, wasn't screaming anymore, and even in the darkness Dalton could see why. His throat had been torn open, his small body twisted at an angle that meant he'd stopped fighting some time ago. The girl was still alive, pressed back against the stone with her arm raised defensively, encircling them both were the wolves. 4 of them, lean and desperate with winter hunger, their eyes catching what little light filtered through the storm. Dalton didn't think. He raised the rifle and fired, the crack of the shot momentarily louder than the wind. 1 wolf went down, another scattered, but the remaining 2 turned on him with a speed that gave him no time to reload. He swung the rifle like a club, felt it connect with bone and teeth, and then he was on the ground with a wolf's jaws snapping at his face and claws tearing through his coat. He got his forearm up in time to catch the bite meant for his throat, felt teeth punch through leather and skin, and drove his hunting knife into the animal's ribs with his free hand. The wolf yelped and released him, stumbling back, and the last one finally broke and ran into the storm. The silence that followed was deafening. Dalton lay there in the snow, bleeding, his arms screaming with pain, and listened to the girl crying. Not loud, not hysterical, just soft, broken sound that told him she'd been crying for a long time and didn't have much left. He crawled to her. Her left wrist was mangled, torn by teeth that had tried to drag her away from the rocks. Blood soaked her sleeve and dripped onto the snow in patterns that looked black in the darkness. She was going into shock, her eyes unfocused, her lips turning blue. Dalton tore strips from his own shirt, wrapped her wrist as tight as he dared, and lifted her into his arms. She was so light it terrified him. She shouldn't have been that light. The walk back to his cabin took an eternity. The storm fought him every step, the girl's blood soaking through the makeshift bandage and onto his chest, his own arm throbbing where the wolf had bitten him. He talked to her the whole way, nonsense mostly, just sounds to let her know she wasn't alone, that someone was fighting for her. She didn't respond, but her small hand clutched something, a beaded bracelet on her uninjured wrist, like it was the only thing keeping her tethered to life. He got her to the cabin, laid her by the fire, and did what he could with whiskey and clean cloth and prayers to a God he wasn't sure was listening. She drifted in and out of consciousness, whimpering when he cleaned the wounds, going silent when the pain got too bad. Dalton worked through the night, keeping the fire high, keeping her warm, watching her chest rise and fall with a rhythm that seemed too fragile to sustain. By dawn, the storm had broken, and with the light came riders, Apache, moving fast across the fresh snow, following tracks that the storm hadn't quite covered. They came armed and wary, and at their head was a man whose face could have been carved from stone. He dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, strode into Dalton's cabin without asking permission, and looked at the girl lying by the fire with an expression that managed to contain both relief and rage. "My daughter," the man said, and those two words carried the weight of everything: gratitude, grief, pride wounded by the necessity of accepting help from an outsider. Dalton stepped back, giving the man space. "Her brother is dead. I know." The man knelt beside his daughter, touched her face with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the hardness of his voice. "You did this." He gestured to the bandages, the blood-soaked cloths Dalton had used. "I did what I could." The man was silent for a long moment, and when he looked up at Dalton, his eyes held something complicated. "You saved her life," he said. It wasn't a question, and it wasn't exactly gratitude either. It was acknowledgement of a fact that created an obligation he clearly didn't want. Anyone would have. "No," the man cut him off. "Not anyone." He stood, his full height impressive even in the low-ceiling cabin. "I'm called Red Hawk. This is my daughter, Iona. You have given her back to me." He paused, his jaw working. "But I will not call this a debt. My people do not owe the whites. We take no charity. We accept no claim on our honor." Dalton felt something twist in his chest, but he nodded. "I don't want anything. I just want her to live." Red Hawk studied him for a long moment, then turned to one of his men and spoke in Apache. The warrior approached the girl carefully, lifted her with a tenderness that suggested she was precious beyond measure, and carried her toward the door. As they prepared to leave, Red Hawk paused, looking back at Dalton one last time. "She will live," he said, "and she will forget this night. Forget you. That is how it must be." He pointed to the beaded bracelet that had fallen from the girl's wrist onto the cabin floor. "Leave that here. Let it be the only thing that remembers." Then they were gone, horses disappearing into the snow-bright morning, leaving Dalton alone with a floor covered in blood and a small bracelet that smelled like smoke and leather and a child who should have died but didn't. He'd kept the bracelet for years, tucked in a drawer where he wouldn't have to look at it, where it wouldn't remind him of the boy who didn't make it or the father's pride that couldn't accept help or the girl whose life he'd saved at the cost of nearly his own. Eventually, he'd assumed the memory had died with that winter, buried under years of drought and debt and the slow erosion of everything his family had built. He'd never imagined she would come back, and he'd certainly never imagined she would come back as this. A chief with warriors at her back and a debt she claimed had been growing for 15 winters, standing at his fence line with the same bracelet he thought he'd lost and a warning that someone was coming to take everything he had left. Iona had just opened her mouth to continue when the sound of engines cut through the morning air. Dalton's head snapped toward the road, his stomach sinking as 3 vehicles came into view. A county sheriff truck followed by 2 black SUVs with tinted windows that screamed money and lawyers. They pulled up to the gate with the kind of confidence that came from knowing the law was whatever they said it was. The deputy who climbed out of the lead truck was someone Dalton recognized, a territorial officer named Kendrick who'd always been more interested in keeping his job than doing it right. Behind him came 2 men in suits, one carrying a leather briefcase, the other holding a manila folder thick with documents. They moved with the rehearsed precision of people who'd done this before, who knew exactly how the next 10 minutes would play out. "Dalton Hale," Kendrick called out, not quite meeting his eyes. "Got some official business, hey? Need you to come down and hear this proper." Dalton stayed on the porch, his boots planted. "Whatever you've got to say, you can say it from there." The man with the briefcase stepped forward, his smile professional and utterly without warmth. "Mr. Hale, my name is Richard Voss, legal representative for the Copper Ridge Mining Syndicate. I'm here to serve you with a foreclosure notice and a security clearance order." He pulled papers from the folder, holding them up like they were holy writ. "As of this morning, your property has been officially designated as part of a proposed mineral extraction corridor and rail development zone. Due to outstanding debts totaling approximately $230,000, compounded by recent security concerns, this land is being seized under territorial development statutes." "Security concerns?" Dalton's voice came out rough. "What the hell are you talking about?" The second suit stepped forward, younger, hungrier. Over the past 6 months, there have been multiple reports of Apache raiding parties using this property as a staging ground for attacks on neighboring ranches and supply routes. Livestock theft, property damage, threats of violence. Your land borders tribal territory, and you've been identified as someone who's, let's say, sympathetic to their cause. That makes you a liability, Mr. Hale. And liabilities get cleared. The words hit Dalton like a physical blow. That's a goddamn lie. There haven't been any raids. I haven't seen. We have documentation. Voss interrupted smoothly, gesturing to the folder. Witness statements, damage assessments, law enforcement incident reports. All of it points to a coordinated pattern of tribal aggression originating from or passing through your property. Whether you're actively collaborating or simply turning a blind eye doesn't matter legally. The result is the same. Dalton felt the ground shifting under him, the trap closing with a precision that told him this had been planned long before today. They'd built a case out of lies and paperwork, manufactured a threat that justified taking what they wanted. And he had nothing to fight them with except his word against their documents. This is insane, Dalton said, his voice rising. I've been on this land my whole life. I've never harbored anyone, never. The foreclosure is already processed. Voss cut him off with the bored efficiency of someone swatting a fly. The security order gives us authority to clear the property immediately. You have until tomorrow morning at sunrise to vacate. After that, we'll return with additional personnel and remove you by force if necessary. Any property left behind becomes part of the asset seizure. Tomorrow. Dalton's mind reeled. You can't just. We can, and we have. Voss's smile never wavered. The syndicate has invested considerable resources into this development corridor. The territorial governor has signed off on it. This isn't personal, Mr. Hale. It's progress. That's when Iona moved. She'd been standing silent by the fence the entire time, watching with an expression that gave nothing away. But now she stepped forward with a kind of quiet authority that made all three men turn to look at her. Her warriors shifted behind her, not threatening but present, and the morning air seemed to change temperature. These raids you speak of, Iona said, her voice carrying easily across the distance. When did they occur? Which ranches were attacked? Voss barely glanced at her. That's none of your concern, miss. This is official territorial business. I am Chief Iona of the Red Ridge Apache, she said, and there was steel underneath the calm now. Any raid conducted by my people would be my concern. So I ask again, when and where did these attacks happen? The youngest suit bristled. Look, we don't need to justify ourselves to. The Morrison Ranch, Kendrick interrupted, pulling a notebook from his pocket, clearly uncomfortable but following his script. 3 weeks ago, 50 head of cattle stolen. The Patterson place 2 weeks before that, barn burned. The Whitfield property last month, fences cut, equipment vandalized. All of them reported seeing Apache riders, all of them border Mr. Hale's land. Iona's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. The Morrison Ranch runs Herefords. The Patterson barn that burned was empty and scheduled for demolition. The Whitfield property has been trying to sell for 6 months with no buyers. She paused, letting that sink in. And not one of my people has left the reservation for raids in over a decade. We have no need of your cattle, no interest in your barns, and no warriors who answer to anyone but me. That's your claim, Voss said dismissively. We have documented evidence that says otherwise. You have manufactured evidence, Iona corrected, her voice hardening, designed to justify seizing land that doesn't belong to you. Land that, if you'd bothered to check the original territorial treaties, partially overlaps with Apache ground granted in perpetuity by federal agreement in 1873. That made Voss pause, just for a second, before his professional mask slid back into place. Those treaties have been superseded by modern development law. And frankly, whether the land is disputed or not doesn't change Mr. Hale's financial situation. He owes money he can't pay. The foreclosure stands regardless of your tribal claims. Then this isn't about security at all, Dalton said, the pieces finally clicking together. This is about the copper deposit under my land. You manufactured these raids to justify a faster seizure. Voss's smile turned cold. What it's about, Mr. Hale, is that tomorrow morning you won't be here. Whether you believe our evidence or not is irrelevant. The law is on our side, the money is on our side, and quite frankly, you're just one broke rancher with no options and no friends. He glanced at Iona with open contempt. And a tribal chief with no authority outside her reservation isn't going to change that. We'll see, Iona said quietly. The youngest suit laughed. You people are a problem that's about to be cleared along with this property. You can stand there and make all the claims you want. But by this time tomorrow, this conversation will be over. Mr. Hale will be gone, and the syndicate will begin extracting resources that should have been developed decades ago instead of being wasted on failed ranches and treaty ground no one uses. Kendrick shifted uncomfortably. Look, Dalton, I'm just doing my job here. If you want to file an appeal, you can come to the courthouse on Monday. But it won't matter, Voss finished. Because by Monday, the excavation equipment will already be here, and possession is 9/10 of the law. So take the night, Mr. Hale. Pack what you can carry, say your goodbyes, and be gone by first light. Because if you're still here when we come back, you'll be removed by force, arrested for trespassing, and spend the next 6 months in a territorial jail cell while your property gets torn apart for copper ore. He tucked the papers back into his briefcase, nodded to Kendrick, and turned toward the vehicles. The younger suit followed, still smirking. Kendrick lingered for a moment, looking like he wanted to say something, then thought better of it and climbed back into his truck. The engine started. The vehicles turned around, kicking up dust as they headed back down the road. And then they were gone, leaving Dalton standing on his porch with the taste of ash in his mouth and the knowledge that everything his family had built for 3 generations was going to be stolen by men in suits who'd never worked a day of honest labor in their lives. Iona watched them disappear, her expression unreadable. Then she turned back to Dalton. Now do you understand, she said. Why I came. Why I had to. Dalton nodded slowly, his hands clenched into fists. They're going to take everything. Not if I can help it, Iona said. But we need to move fast. And you need to trust me. Dalton looked at her, at the woman who'd been a dying child in his arms 15 years ago, who'd become a chief with warriors at her back, who'd ridden here at dawn with a bracelet and a warning and a debt she claimed had been growing all this time. What do you need me to do? He asked. Iona's expression shifted into something that might have been a smile if it weren't so fierce. First, we need to prove those raids never happened. And then we need to make sure the syndicate understands exactly who they are fighting. The dust from the departing vehicles was still settling when Iona turned back to Dalton, her expression shifting from the controlled calm she'd maintained during the confrontation to something more focused, more deliberate. She gestured to one of her warriors, a lean man with gray threaded through his braided hair, and he dismounted smoothly, pulling a leather satchel from his saddlebag. He brought it to Iona with the kind of reverence usually reserved for sacred objects. They came with their papers, Iona said, unbuckling the satchel. So did I. She pulled out a rolled document, its edges yellowed with age, the paper thick and fibrous in a way modern documents never were. She unrolled it carefully on the fence post, holding the corners down with practiced hands, and Dalton found himself stepping closer despite the confusion still churning in his gut. The document was covered in dense handwriting, official seals pressed into wax at the bottom, the kind of legal language that belonged to a different century. Treaty of Red Ridge, signed October 1873, Iona said, running her finger along the faded ink. Between the territorial governor and my great-great-grandfather. It guarantees Apache access to traditional hunting grounds, water sources, and sacred sites in perpetuity, regardless of land ownership changes. She tapped a section of text. This clause here specifically protects what was called the Winter Trail, a route my people used for generations to reach the burial caves in the northern hills. Dalton squinted at the document, trying to make sense of the archaic phrasing. I don't understand. What does that have to do with my ranch? Iona pulled out a second paper, this one newer, a territorial survey map marked with hand-drawn boundaries and notations. She laid it beside the treaty, aligning features until the overlay became clear. Your land sits directly on that winter trail. Right here. Her finger traced a line that ran through what Dalton knew as his northern pasture. The burial caves are 2 miles beyond your property line, but the traditional access route crosses your land. Under federal law, any seizure or development that interferes with treaty-protected routes requires tribal consent and environmental review. They never mentioned any of this, Dalton said, his mind racing through the implications. Because they hoped no one would check, Iona replied, an edge of satisfaction in her voice. The syndicate has been buying up land for months, but they've been careful to avoid anything that would trigger federal oversight. Your property was supposed to be just another foreclosure, processed quickly and quietly before anyone noticed the treaty complications. She rolled the documents back up. But I noticed. I've been tracking their moves since they started circling the reservation boundaries last year. She pulled out a third set of papers, these ones more recent, correspondence on territorial letterhead, notarized statements, and what looked like accounting ledgers. I also have these. Letters from a territorial clerk in Flagstaff who got nervous about some irregularities in land seizure filings. Testimonies from ranchers who say they were pressured to file false raid reports in exchange for debt relief. And ledgers showing that the Copper Ridge Syndicate has been systematically inflating debt calculations and adding fraudulent liens to force foreclosures. She met Dalton's eyes. Your debt isn't $230,000. According to these records, it's closer to $70,000, still substantial, but not insurmountable. The rest is fabricated interest and fees that have no legal basis. Dalton felt something crack open in his chest, a mixture of rage and hope that threatened to choke him. Why didn't anyone tell me? Why didn't? Because the people who know are either bought off or scared silent, Iona said bluntly. The syndicate has money, connections, and enough legal muscle to bury opposition before it starts. But they don't have federal jurisdiction over treaty violations. And they don't have proof of raids that never happened. She paused, letting that sink in. That's why I'm here. Not just to repay a debt, but because you're standing on ground that's protected by laws older and stronger than anything the syndicate can throw at you. They just didn't expect anyone to remember. She turned to the warrior with the satchel and spoke in Apache. He nodded, reached into the bag again, and pulled out a wooden stake, smooth, carved, painted with symbols Dalton didn't recognize, and a strip of red cloth that looked like it had been dyed with something natural, something that held color the way only handmade things did. What are you doing? Dalton asked as Iona took the stake and walked to the fence line. Claiming sanctuary, she said simply. She drove the stake into the ground with 3 solid strikes from a rock, then tied the red cloth to it so it hung like a banner, visible from the road. Under tribal law, this red marker declares that this land is now under Apache protection. Anyone who moves against you moves against the Red Ridge Apache. Any attempt to seize this property will be treated as a violation of federal treaty rights and an act of aggression against my people. Dalton stared at the red cloth snapping in the morning breeze, his throat tight. You can't do this. I won't let you bring that kind of trouble onto your people for my sake. The syndicate has money, lawyers. They'll come at you with everything. Iona turned to face him, and there was something fierce and unyielding in her expression. You rode into a blizzard 15 years ago for a child you didn't know, from a people not your own, when you had every reason to stay by your fire and mind your business. You nearly died saving my life. She touched the scars on her wrist. You think I'm going to stand by now and watch them steal your land with lies and paper? You already brought trouble on yourself, Dalton Hale, by being the kind of man who does what's right even when it costs him everything. Now it's my turn. But if they push back, if they bring more men, more legal pressure, then they'll learn that the Red Ridge Apache do not back down from bullies, no matter how expensive their suits are. Iona's voice was steel wrapped in silk. And they'll learn that federal treaty law trumps territorial development statutes every time, as long as someone is willing to fight in the right courts with the right evidence. Dalton wanted to argue, wanted to protest that she was risking too much, but the look in her eyes told him the decision was already made. This wasn't about consulting him. This was about honoring something deeper than debt, something that lived in the space between mercy given and justice returned. What happens now? he asked instead. Iona glanced at the sun, gauging the time. Now I need to send word. The evidence I have is strong, but it needs to reach people who can act on it. Federal Indian Affairs agents, territorial judges who aren't in the syndicate's pocket, journalists who can make this public before it gets buried. She gestured to her warriors. My people will ride to contacts we've cultivated over the years. By tomorrow morning, this won't be a quiet foreclosure anymore. It'll be a federal case involving treaty violations, fraudulent lands, and manufactured evidence. The syndicate wanted to move fast and quiet. We're going to make it slow and loud. And if they come back before tomorrow? Dalton asked. If they decide not to wait. Iona's smile was thin and dangerous. Then they'll find that removing you isn't as simple as they thought. That red cloth means something, Dalton. It means you're not alone anymore. She mounted her horse in one smooth motion, the other warriors falling in behind her. Stay on your land. Don't let them intimidate you into leaving before sunrise. And trust that when they return tomorrow, things will look very different than they expect. Who's coming? Dalton called after her. What kind of help are you bringing? Iona looked back over her shoulder, and for the first time since she'd arrived, something like warmth crossed her face. The kind that remembers what you did on a night when no one was watching. The kind that understands debts that grow for 15 winters don't get paid with simple thanks. She turned her horse toward the tree line. By tomorrow, Dalton Hale, you're going to learn that saving one child can save a lot more than you ever imagined. Then she was gone, her warriors disappearing into the forest with the same quiet precision they'd arrived with, leaving Dalton alone on his failing ranch with a red cloth snapping in the wind and the impossible hope that maybe, just maybe, the story wasn't over yet. He looked at the banner, at the stake driven into ground his family had worked for 3 generations, and for the first time in months, he didn't feel like he was drowning. He felt like he was standing on solid ground, with allies he'd never expected and a fight that finally meant something beyond just survival. The sun climbed higher. The morning stretched out, and Dalton waited, wondering what dawn would bring and who would be standing beside him when it came. Dalton spent the night on his porch with his rifle across his knees, watching the road and waiting for headlights that never came. The syndicate didn't return. Neither did the deputy. The only sound was wind moving through empty fields and the occasional cry of a night bird hunting in the dark. By the time the sun started climbing, he was exhausted, wired on bad coffee and worse thoughts, wondering if Iona's promise had been hope or delusion. Then, just after mid-morning, he saw dust rising on the eastern road. Not one vehicle. Several. A truck, then a wagon, then another truck that looked like it had been held together with rust and prayer. They came slowly, cautiously, like people who'd been burned before and weren't eager to get close to fire again. Dalton stood, his hand instinctively checking the rifle. But something about the way they moved, scattered, uncertain, definitely not organized, told him these weren't syndicate men. The first truck pulled up to his gate and a man climbed out, older, weathered, wearing overalls that had been patched so many times the original denim was hard to find. He looked at Dalton with a kind of exhaustion that came from losing things slowly over years instead of all at once. You Dalton Hale, the man called. I am. Name's Warren. Got a message last night from some Apache riders saying I should be here this morning if I wanted to stop Copper Ridge from finishing what they started. He gestured back at the vehicles still pulling in behind him. Sounds like I'm not the only one. Over the next half hour, they kept coming. A widow named Clara Simmons who arrived in a wagon driven by her teenage son. A mill owner called Dutch Kerrigan with hands too scarred and callous to be anything but honest work. 2 brothers named Patterson who'd lost their families grazing land 6 months ago. A Mexican farmer named Esteban whose accent was thick but whose anger was crystal clear. By the time the last truck rolled in, there were nearly 20 people standing in Dalton's yard, looking at each other with the uncomfortable recognition of shared ruin. Iona arrived just before noon, riding in with 2 of her warriors and another person Dalton didn't recognize, a white woman in travel-stained clothes with a leather satchel that looked like it carried official weight. Iona dismounted and surveyed the gathered crowd with satisfaction. Good, she said simply. You came. We came because your riders said you had proof, Warren said. his voice carrying the skepticism of someone who'd heard promises before. Proof that what happened to us wasn't bad luck or bad business. That it was intentional. It was, Iona said. She turned to one of her warriors, who was unrolling something large and unwieldy, a map, hand-drawn but detailed, showing property lines, roads, and geographical features across what looked like 50 square miles of territory. She spread it across Dalton's porch railing, weighing down the corners with stones. Come closer. Look. They gathered around, and Iona began pointing to marked properties. This is Dalton's ranch. Hey. Her finger moved. This is the Simmons homestead, foreclosed 8 months ago after a well was condemned for contamination that was never proven. She moved again. The Patterson grazing land, seized after reports of Apache raiders that my people never sent. The Kerrigan mill, bankrupted by a contract dispute over lumber deliveries that were documented but never credited. Each time she pointed, someone in the crowd nodded or made a sound of bitter recognition. Here's Esteban Ortiz's farm, lost when water rights were suddenly transferred to a holding company no one had heard of. The Morrison Ranch, still standing but barely, under pressure from invented cattle theft. The Whitfield property, condemned for structural issues and sold at auction before repairs were even estimated. Her finger traced a line connecting all the marked properties, and the pattern became impossible to ignore. Every single one of these properties forms a corridor, a straight line from the copper deposit under Dalton's land to the railway junction 40 miles east. The silence that followed was heavy and cold. They targeted us, Clara Simmons said, her voice shaking. All of us. Deliberately. For over a year, Iona confirmed. The Copper Ridge Syndicate has been systematically removing anyone who owned land along their planned mining road and rail spur. They used different tactics depending on what would work. Fake debts, fabricated complaints, manufactured emergencies. But the goal was always the same. Clear the corridor, buy the land cheap, and build their infrastructure without opposition or regulatory delays. That's a hell of a claim, Dutch Kerrigan said, though his voice lacked conviction. You got more than a map to back it up. Iona gestured to the woman with the satchel. This is Margaret Chen, a federal investigator with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. She's been tracking syndicate land acquisitions near reservation boundaries for 6 months. When my riders reached her last night with our evidence, she came immediately. Margaret stepped forward, her expression all business. I've reviewed the documentation Chief Iona provided, treaty maps, debt records, witness statements, and correspondence from territorial officials who flagged irregularities. Combined with my own case files, there's enough here to justify a federal investigation into systematic fraud, treaty violations, and possible racketeering. She paused, but investigations take time. And according to Chief Iona, the syndicate is planning to move on this property today. They gave me until sunrise, Dalton said. It's past that now. Which means they are probably regrouping, getting more men, making sure they can force the issue if you don't leave voluntarily, Margaret said. That's why it's critical that when they arrive, they don't find one isolated rancher they can intimidate or remove quietly. They need to find witnesses, documentation, federal authority. She looked around at the gathered crowd. They need to find that their quiet land grab just became very loud and very complicated. You're asking us to stand here and face them, Warren said slowly. Men with money and lawyers and probably guns if it comes to that. I'm asking you to stand as witnesses to a pattern you're all part of, Margaret corrected. No one here is being asked to fight. But your presence, your testimony, your willingness to say out loud what was done to you, that changes everything. Isolated incidents can be dismissed. A coordinated scheme affecting 20 properties across tribal treaty land cannot. One of the Patterson brothers shook his head. Federal investigators, tribal chiefs, maps, and paperwork, none of that stopped them from taking our land. What makes you think it'll stop them now? Because this time it's not happening in the dark, Iona said, her voice cutting through the doubt. This time there are records, witnesses, federal jurisdiction triggered by treaty violations. The syndicate's power comes from moving fast and quiet, from crushing people before they can organize or understand what's happening. She gestured at the crowd. You're organized now. You understand now. And you're standing on ground that's protected by laws older than the syndicate, older than the territory itself. She's right, Clara Simmons said quietly. They took my home because I was alone and didn't know who to ask for help. Because I believed them when they said the well was contaminated and I had to leave for my son's safety. Her voice hardened. But I'm not alone now. And I'm tired of being ashamed of something that was done to me instead of angry at the people who did it. Dutch Kerrigan nodded slowly. I lost my mill because I thought I'd made bad deals, hired the wrong people, failed my family. He looked at the map, at his property marked among all the others. But it wasn't failure. It was theft. And I'll be damned if I'm going to let them keep stealing just because standing up is uncomfortable. One by one, the others began nodding, murmuring agreement, that shift happening in real time from isolated shame to collective outrage. They'd all thought they were alone, that their ruin was personal, that no one else would understand or care. But seeing their stories laid out together on a map, seeing the deliberate pattern, transformed victims into witnesses and shame into fury. When they come, Dalton said, finding his voice, you'll stand with me. We'll stand with you, Warren confirmed, and the others echoed him, some firm, some uncertain, but all present. Not because we're warriors or heroes, but because we're done being quiet about what was taken from us. Iona rolled the map back up carefully, her expression satisfaction mixed with something deeper. I've already sent copies of everything to a circuit judge and a federal Indian agent. They are writing now to review the evidence and issue temporary injunctions against any foreclosures pending investigation. She looked at Dalton. The syndicate doesn't know that yet. When they arrive expecting to clear an isolated property, they're going to find a crowd, federal oversight, and documentation of a conspiracy that goes far beyond your reach. And if they try to force it anyway, Esteban asked, then they'll be doing it in front of witnesses, a federal investigator, and people who are ready to make sure the truth gets told no matter how expensive their lawyers are, Margaret said. The law moves slowly, but it does move. And once federal jurisdiction is triggered, territorial development law takes a backseat. They can't just bulldoze their way through treaty protections and fraud allegations. The sound of engines cut through the conversation, distant but growing closer. Everyone turned toward the road, tension crackling through the group like electricity. Dalton felt his heartbeat kick up, his hand moving instinctively toward his rifle. But Iona caught his arm. Not yet, she said quietly. Let them come. Let them see what they're actually up against. The vehicles appeared on the horizon, black SUVs, the deputy's truck, and behind them a transport carrying what looked like private security, men in tactical gear who definitely weren't there for conversation. They rolled up to the property line and stopped, doors opening, and Richard Voss stepped out with the same professional smile he'd worn yesterday. But this time, when he looked at Dalton's property, his smile faltered. Because Dalton wasn't alone. He was surrounded by 20 people who'd been ruined the same way he almost was. He had a federal investigator standing on his porch with official documentation. He had a tribal chief with treaty rights and warriors at her back. And he had a map that showed exactly what Copper Ridge had done, laid out in a pattern too clear to deny and too public to bury. Voss's expression shifted from confidence to calculation, his eyes sweeping the crowd, the red banner still flying on the fence, the federal agent watching him with a detached interest of someone who'd seen this movie before and knew how it ended. Mr. Hale, Voss called out, his voice still smooth but missing some of its earlier certainty. I see you've gathered some friends. That's fine. Doesn't change the legal reality. You were given a deadline, and it's passed. This property is being seized under territorial law, and anyone interfering is subject to. Federal jurisdiction supersedes territorial law when treaty land is involved, Margaret interrupted, stepping to the edge of the porch. I'm Margaret Chen, Bureau of Indian Affairs. This property sits on an Apache winter trail protected by the Treaty of 1873, which means any seizure requires tribal consent and federal environmental review, neither of which you have. Voss's jaw tightened. That's a stalling tactic. These people are. Witnesses to a coordinated fraud scheme affecting over 20 properties along your proposed development corridor, Margaret continued. I have documentation, testimony, and evidence suggesting systematic debt manipulation, false reporting, and conspiracy to violate federal treaty protections. I've already filed for an emergency injunction, and a circuit judge is en route to review the case. For the first time since Dalton had met him, Richard Voss looked genuinely uncertain. His eyes moved from Margaret to Iona to the crowd of people who weren't backing down, and Dalton could almost see him recalculating odds, running scenarios, trying to figure out how a simple foreclosure had turned into a federal case with witnesses and oversight. This isn't over, Voss said finally, but the threat lacked the weight it had carried yesterday. We have legal rights, contracts, documentation. So do we, Iona said quietly. And unlike yours, ours isn't built on lies. Voss stared at her for a long moment, then turned and got back into his SUV without another word. The security transport didn't even unload. They just turned around and drove back down the road, leaving dust and silence in their wake. The crowd exhaled collectively, some laughing, some just shaking, the tension breaking like a fever. Dalton found himself sitting down hard on the porch steps, his legs suddenly unreliable, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on him with dizzying force. They'd done it. They'd actually done it. This isn't finished, Margaret warned, though her tone was less severe than her words. They'll regroup, hire better lawyers, try to find another angle. But you bought time, and time is what investigations need. How long? Dalton asked. Weeks, maybe months. Margaret shrugged. But every day they're not bulldozing your land is a day we're building a case that'll make it impossible for them to operate this way again. Iona sat down beside Dalton on the steps, her warriors keeping watch but relaxed now, the immediate threat past. You asked me yesterday what kind of help I was bringing, she said. This is it. Not cavalry, not a rescue. Just people who remember what it means when someone stands up for what's right, even when it costs them everything. She looked at the crowd milling in his yard, sharing stories, comparing notes, no longer isolated in their grief. You saved one life 15 years ago. Now you're watching that life save yours. And a lot of others besides. Dalton didn't trust himself to speak, so he just nodded, watching the sun climb higher over land that was still his, surrounded by people who'd been strangers yesterday and were allies now, bound together by a pattern of cruelty that had finally been named and would no longer be endured in silence. The red banner snapped in the wind, and Dalton thought about debts that grew for 15 winters, about choices made in blizzards when no one was watching, about the strange mathematics of mercy that somehow multiplied instead of depleting. He'd saved a child once, expecting nothing in return, and she'd come back with an army. The afternoon sun was directly overhead when the dust began rising from 3 different directions, and Dalton knew with cold certainty that whatever happened next would either save everything or destroy it completely. There was no middle ground left. From the east, the syndicate vehicles returned, more of them this time. The black SUVs flanked by 2 trucks carrying men in tactical gear who weren't bothering to hide the rifles anymore. Richard Voss rode in the lead vehicle, and even from a distance Dalton could see the tight set of his jaw, the kind of anger that came from someone who'd been embarrassed and was determined not to let it happen twice. Deputy Kendrick's truck rolled with them, and Dalton felt a sick twist in his gut seeing law enforcement still siding with money over justice. From the south came something worse. A column of cavalry, at least 20 mounted soldiers in territorial uniforms, led by a colonel whose ramrod posture suggested he took his authority very seriously. They moved in formation, disciplined and armed, the kind of presence meant to remind everyone that the government's word was final. Someone had called them. Someone had made this ranch sound like a threat that needed military intervention. But from the west came hope. A single wagon, moving slower than the others but carrying more weight than all of them combined. Margaret Chen sat beside the driver, and next to her was an older man in a black coat and hat that marked him as someone official, someone with the kind of authority that didn't need guns to back it up. Behind them rode 2 more Apache warriors bearing the red banner that matched the one flying from Dalton's fence. All 3 groups converged on the property simultaneously, creating a triangle of tension that felt like the air before lightning strikes. The syndicate men spread out along the road. The soldiers formed ranks on the southern approach, and the wagon rolled directly up to Dalton's gate where the crowd of ranchers and townsfolk had instinctively drawn together, united by shared fear and stubbornness. Voss stepped out first, his professional mask firmly back in place. "This has gone far enough," he announced, his voice carrying with practiced authority. "Mr. Hale, you were given a legal order to vacate this property. Your refusal, combined with this gathering of armed individuals, constitutes obstruction of justice and poses a public safety threat." The colonel dismounted, his hand resting on his sidearm. "I received reports of Apache warriors massing on settler land with the potential for violence. Chief Iona, I'm going to need you and your people to stand down and disperse immediately before this situation escalates." Iona remained perfectly still, her warriors flanking her, the red cloth banner visible behind them. "We have gathered on treaty-protected ground to prevent the illegal seizure of land that crosses Apache winter trails. We are armed, as is our right. We have not threatened anyone. We will not disperse. Your presence here is threatening by definition." Voss interjected smoothly, seeing an opening. "These good people are frightened. There have been reports of Apache raids for months, livestock stolen, property damaged. Mr. Hale has clearly been collaborating with tribal elements to resist lawful foreclosure, and now we have a situation where settlers are being intimidated by armed warriors on land that legally belongs to the Copper Ridge Syndicate as of sunrise this morning. The land belongs to no one until proper jurisdiction is established," Margaret Chen said, climbing down from the wagon with the older man following. "And that jurisdiction is federal, not territorial, which means your foreclosure notice has no standing until treaty compliance is verified and the debt calculations are independently audited." The older man stepped forward, his voice carrying the weight of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I am Circuit Judge Emmett Hawthorne. I've reviewed preliminary evidence provided by Agent Chen suggesting systematic fraud in debt calculations, falsification of incident reports, and potential conspiracy to violate the Treaty of 1873. Until my investigation is complete, no property seizures will proceed in this district." Voss's expression darkened. "Your Honor, with all respect, the evidence you've been shown is manufactured by parties with a vested interest in disrupting legitimate business operations. These raid reports came from multiple ranches over months. They can't all be lies." "Then let's ask them," Judge Hawthorne said simply. He turned to the gathered crowd. "How many of you filed reports of Apache raids on your property?" Silence. Then Warren stepped forward, his weathered face set hard. "I filed one, 6 months ago, because a man from the syndicate came to my door and said if I reported Apache stealing my cattle, he could get my debt reduced and make sure I didn't lose my land." His voice cracked. "I filed the report. They reduced nothing, and I lost the land anyway." Clara Simmons raised her hand, trembling. "They told me the same thing. Said Apache contaminated my well, that I needed to report it for insurance purposes. I did. The insurance denied the claim, and a week later, my property was condemned and I was forced out." One by one, others came forward, Dutch Kerrigan, the Patterson brothers, Esteban Ortiz, each sharing variations of the same story. Pressure, promises, manufactured incidents designed to create a paper trail that justified seizures while painting the Apache as threats. The pattern was undeniable, spoken aloud by people who'd been too ashamed or too isolated to compare notes until now. The colonel's expression shifted from certainty to confusion. "These are serious allegations. If these reports were falsified—" "They were," Iona said, her voice cutting through. "My people have not conducted raids in over a decade. We have no need of settler cattle or equipment. We have no warriors who operate without my direct authorization. Every report filed against us is fiction, designed to make us appear dangerous so land near our borders could be seized without scrutiny." Voss laughed, harsh and dismissive. "And we're supposed to take your word for that? You're here with armed men, making threats, disrupting lawful business." "She's here because I asked her to come," Dalton said, surprising himself with the steadiness of his own voice. Everyone turned to look at him, and he stepped forward from the porch, his hands shaking but his spine straight. 15 years ago, I saved her life. I never asked for anything in return. Never expected anything. But when your people came to steal my land with lies, she came to stand with me because that's what honor looks like. Real honor. Not the kind you buy with legal documents and hired guns. That's a nice story, Voss said dismissively. But it doesn't change the legal reality of your debt or the fact that you're currently in violation of. Show them, Iona said quietly, looking at Dalton. Show them what that night cost you. Dalton's throat closed up. He hadn't shown anyone those scars in years, had kept them hidden under long sleeves in silence because they were private, shameful somehow, reminders of a night when he'd almost died doing something most people would call foolish. But Iona was watching him with those dark, steady eyes, and around him stood people who'd shared their own stories, their own shame, and made it into something stronger. His hands went to his shirt buttons. He could hear the crowd shifting, uncomfortable, uncertain what was happening. He pulled the shirt off, standing bare-chested in the afternoon sun, and the scars were impossible to miss. Long white lines across his forearm where wolf teeth had torn through muscle. Claw marks raking his shoulder and chest where he'd wrestled an animal that outweighed him and fought with pure desperation. A puckered scar on his ribs where infection had nearly killed him after the wounds had been stitched closed. I got these pulling a 7-year-old girl away from wolves in a blizzard, Dalton said, his voice rough but clear. She was dying. Her brother was already dead. I didn't know her name. Didn't know if she'd survive. I just knew I couldn't leave a child to be torn apart while I sat safe by my fire. He turned, showing the marks that crossed his back. These scars say I rode into a storm when I could have stayed home. They say I chose right over easy. And they say that when that girl came back 15 years later as a chief with the power to help me, she remembered. He lowered his arm, and Iona stepped forward, raising her own scarred wrist so it was visible to everyone. The thin white lines that matched the pattern of Dalton's wounds, the permanent record of teeth that had tried to drag her away and the man who'd stopped them. These scars say I live because someone chose mercy over comfort, Iona said. They say debts matter. Honor matters. And they say that when a man stands on ground worth defending, I will not let thieves in suits take it with paperwork and lies. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the soldiers had gone still, staring at the matched scars, at the living proof of a story that couldn't be faked or manufactured. The ranchers in the crowd were nodding, some with tears in their eyes, seeing in Dalton's scars the same kind of choice they'd failed to make. The choice to fight back, to stand up, to refuse to accept theft just because it came with official stamps and legal language. Judge Hawthorne stepped forward, his expression grave. Mr. Voss, I'm issuing an immediate injunction against all property seizures pending investigation into allegations of fraud, conspiracy, and treaty violations. Furthermore, Voss's hand moved to his jacket, fast and desperate, and Dalton saw the gun before anyone else did. The syndicate boss was reaching for a weapon, his face twisted with rage and panic, a man watching his empire collapse and deciding to take someone down with him. The shot was deafening, but it didn't come from Voss's gun. It came from Deputy Kendrick's service weapon, the bullet striking Voss's pistol and sending it spinning from his hand before he could even clear the holster. Voss screamed, clutching his hand, and the tactical security men froze, suddenly realizing their employer was disarmed and bleeding and that every gun in the vicinity, soldiers, deputies, ranchers, was now pointed at them. Kendrick stepped forward, his weapon still raised, his face pale but determined. I'm done, he said simply. I've been looking the other way for months because I was scared of losing my job. But I'm not going to watch a man get shot for defending his own land from thieves. He looked at Voss with disgust. Richard Voss, you're under arrest for attempted assault with a deadly weapon, conspiracy to commit fraud, and falsification of official documents. The colonel nodded to his soldiers, who moved in to disarm the security team and take Voss into custody. The syndicate boss was shouting something about lawyers and rights and how this was all a misunderstanding, but no one was listening. The magic was broken. The facade of legitimacy had shattered the moment he'd reached for that gun. Margaret Chen pulled out handcuffs, actual federal handcuffs, and approached Voss with the calm efficiency of someone who'd done this before. Richard Voss, you are also under federal investigation for conspiracy to violate the Indian Treaty of 1873, racketeering, and systematic fraud affecting interstate commerce. You have the right to remain silent, which I strongly suggest you exercise before you make this worse. Judge Hawthorne turned to address the crowd, his voice ringing with authority. This investigation will continue. Every property seizure conducted by Copper Ridge Mining Syndicate in the past 2 years will be reviewed. Any debts found to be fraudulently inflated will be corrected, and any individual or entity found to have participated in this conspiracy will face federal charges. He looked at Iona. Chief Iona, on behalf of the territorial government, I apologize for the violation of treaty protections and the false accusations made against your people. Justice will be served. Iona inclined her head with grave dignity. See that it is, Your Honor. My people have long memories. The colonel cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. Chief, I apologize for arriving under false pretenses. If I'd known the raid reports were fabricated, you would have done the same thing, Iona said, not unkindly. You were given information and responded appropriately. The fault lies with those who manufacture the information, not those who believed it. She gestured to her warriors. We will remain on this land until the federal investigation is complete and Mr. Hale's property rights are formally secured. Not as a threat, but as witnesses and protectors of ground that matters to both our peoples. The colonel nodded and ordered his men to stand down. The tension that had been coiled tight as a spring finally released, and people began moving again, talking, crying, some laughing with the kind of relief that comes after surviving something that should have destroyed you. Dalton found himself sitting on the porch steps again, his shirt still off, his scars visible to the world, and he didn't care. Iona sat beside him, her warriors taking up positions around the property not as guards but as honored guests, as allies who'd earned their place. You think it's really over? Dalton asked quietly. The immediate threat? Yes, Iona said. The larger fight will take time. Investigations, trials, appeals. But the syndicate's power is broken. They operated in darkness, and we dragged them into light. She looked at him with something that might have been pride. You stood when you could have run. You trusted when you had every reason to doubt. That matters more than you know. Dalton looked at the red banner still flying from his fence, at the crowd of people who'd come because they'd been wronged and stayed because they'd found each other, at the federal judge and the Apache chief and the deputy who'd finally chosen right over easy. 15 years, he said. That's how long it took for one good choice to save my life. Iona smiled, touching the scars on her wrist. 15 years for a debt to grow into justice. 15 years for mercy to multiply into an army. She stood, offering him her hand. Come on, Dalton Hale. You have guests to feed and a ranch to rebuild. And you're not doing it alone anymore. He took her hand, let her pull him to his feet, and looked out at land that was still his, at people who'd become family through shared struggle, at a future that had seemed impossible yesterday but felt inevitable now. The sun was starting to lower, painting everything gold, and Dalton thought about wolves in the snow, about children who lived when they should have died, about debts that couldn't be measured in money and choices that echoed across decades. He'd saved one life in a blizzard, and that life had come back with everything it took to save his. The mathematics of mercy, he thought, was strange and wonderful and worth every scar he carried. The cavalry withdrew as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, the soldiers riding south in formation with considerably less certainty than they'd arrived with. The judge and Margaret Chen departed in their wagon, taking Richard Voss with them in shackles, flanked by federal marshals who'd arrived quietly during the standoff and waited for their moment. The other ranchers lingered longer, shaking Dalton's hand, promising to help rebuild fences and bonds once their own properties were sorted out, speaking in the hushed tones of people who'd witnessed something they'd carry with them for the rest of their lives. By evening, most had gone home, leaving Dalton's yard quieter but not empty. Iona and her warriors remained, tending their horses near the barn, building a small fire in the yard as the temperature dropped. Dalton watched them from his porch, these people who'd been strangers 3 days ago and were something closer to family now, bound together by scars and choices that had echoed across 15 years. Iona approached as twilight settled over the land, 2 tin cups of coffee in her hands. She offered him one and sat beside him on the steps without waiting for invitation, the way people do when formality has been burned away by shared danger. "The investigation will take months," she said, watching the fire. "But Judge Hawthorne is thorough, and Agent Chin doesn't let go once she's found something worth holding. The syndicate's operations in this territory are finished. Every seizure will be reviewed, every debt recalculated, every false report exposed. And the people who've already lost everything?" Dalton asked. "The ones who can't get it back even if the numbers are corrected." "Some losses can't be undone," Iona admitted. "But the pattern is broken. No one else will be targeted this way, and the territory will have to answer for allowing it to happen in the first place." She took a sip of coffee. "There will be settlements, compensation, the kind of bureaucratic justice that takes too long and never feels like enough, but matters anyway." They sat in silence for a moment, watching smoke rise from the fire, and Dalton felt the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on him. The fear, the rage, the impossible hope, the scars he'd revealed to strangers, the gun that had almost gone off, the moment when everything could have ended differently. "I need to tell you something," Iona said, setting her cup down. "About what comes next." Dalton looked at her, seeing something in her expression he couldn't quite read. Not bad, but serious, weighted with the kind of decision that changed futures. "The territory violated treaty protections when they tried to seize your land without Apache consent," she continued. "That violation gives us grounds to renegotiate water rights and land use agreements for the entire valley. Judge Hawthorne has already indicated the territory will be eager to settle rather than fight a federal case they'll lose." She paused. "As part of that settlement, my tribe will receive guaranteed water access and mineral rights consultation for disputed areas. But more importantly, we'll control water allocation for properties that border the Winter Trail." Dalton's stomach tightened. "You're saying you'll control whether my ranch gets water?" "I'm saying I already do, under the original treaty language no one bothered to enforce until now." Iona's expression softened. "And I'm choosing to deed the primary water rights to you, along with a long-term contract to breed and supply horses for the reservation and the territorial outposts. You'll be the bridge between our people and theirs. The man both sides trust because both sides owe you something." The words didn't make sense at first. Dalton's mind kept trying to find the catch, the condition, the moment when this turned into something he'd have to pay for. But Iona just sat there, patient and certain, waiting for him to understand what she was offering. "I can't accept that," he said finally, his voice rough. "It's too much. I didn't save you expecting." "You didn't expect anything," Iona interrupted gently. "That's exactly why you've earned this." She turned to face him fully, her dark eyes steady in the fading light. "Do you know what my father said when he came to take me home that morning? He said you were a fool for risking your life for children not your own. He said mercy was weakness, that the whites would never show us the same kindness, and that I should forget you existed." Dalton remembered Red Hawk's hard face, the pride that wouldn't bend even in gratitude. "But I didn't forget," Iona continued. "I couldn't, because every time I looked at these scars, I remembered that when I was dying in the snow, you didn't calculate whether helping me was worth the risk. You didn't weigh the cost against the benefit. You just rode into the dark because it was right, even though no one would have known if you'd stayed safe by your fire." Her voice dropped lower, more intense. "That choice, the one you made when no one was watching, when there was no reward and no recognition, that's the choice that saved my life. And it's the choice that makes you worthy of this." "I'm just a rancher," Dalton said, feeling something crack inside his chest. "I'm not special. I'm not." "You're the man who walked alone into a blizzard for someone else's children," Iona said firmly. "You're the man who showed me that honor exists even when the world tells you it doesn't. You're the man my people will trust because I trust you, and I'm still alive because of choices you made when you thought no one would ever know." She stood, looking down at him with an expression that was both fierce and gentle. "Your days of barely surviving are over, Dalton Hale. Not because you were lucky, but because 15 years ago you owned something that couldn't be measured in money or contracts or legal documents. You owned a debt that grew in the dark until it became strong enough to save you. Dalton felt tears burning his eyes and didn't bother to hide them. He looked out at his land, the sagging barn, the patched fences, the empty fields that had seemed like evidence of failure just days ago. But now he saw them differently. Saw potential instead of ruin. Saw a future that included Apache riders coming and going like family, horses in the pastures, water rights that would make this valley bloom, contracts that would sustain not just him but the community of wrong people who'd stood with him. "I don't know how to thank you," he said quietly. "You already did," Iona replied. 15 years ago, in a storm, when you could have chosen safety and chose mercy instead. She placed a hand on his shoulder, brief and warm. Now you just have to live well enough to make that choice worth what it cost you. She walked back to the fire, leaving Dalton alone with his thoughts and the impossible gift of a future he'd stopped believing in. He sat there as full darkness fell, watching the Apache warriors tend their fire, hearing the low murmur of their conversation in a language he didn't speak but somehow understood anyway. They were here not as guards or visitors, but as something more permanent, as proof that one night of courage could echo across years and miles and the deep divide between peoples who'd been taught to see each other as enemies. The next morning, Dalton woke early as always, but this time he didn't stand at his window watching his ranch die. He walked outside to find Iona's warriors already working on his fences, repairing posts and tightening wire with the easy competence of people who knew hard work and didn't need to be asked twice. Iona herself was inspecting the barn, making notes on what needed fixing and what could be salvaged. "You don't have to do this," Dalton said, approaching her. "I know," she replied without looking up. "But we're doing it anyway. That's what family does." Family. The word settled over Dalton like warmth after cold, like finding shelter after too long in the storm. He grabbed his tools and joined them, working side by side with Apache warriors to rebuild what had almost been stolen, and it felt right in a way few things in his life ever had. Over the following weeks, more help arrived. The ranchers who'd stood with him during the standoff returned with materials and labor. Clara Simmons brought her son to help with the barn roof. Dutch Kerrigan donated lumber from his rebuilt mill. The Patterson brothers showed up with a truck full of supplies and stayed 3 days fixing what time and poverty had broken. Even Deputy Kendrick came by off-duty to help with the heavy lifting, working in silence like a man trying to atone for months of looking the other way. The red cloth remained tied to Dalton's fence, faded now by sun and wind, but still visible from the road. It had become a symbol in the valley, marking ground where justice had been done and mercy had been repaid. Travelers passing through would stop and ask about it, and the story would spread. The rancher who saved a child, the chief who returned, the syndicate that fell, the scars that proved one act of unseen kindness could reshape an entire valley. Dalton's contract with the reservation brought the first horses within a month, good stock, well-bred, the kind that would make his ranch known throughout the territory. The water rights made his land bloom in ways his father would have called miraculous. And the steady stream of Apache visitors, coming to trade or consult or simply share a meal, transformed his isolated property into a crossroads where two worlds met without the suspicion and violence that had defined them for so long. 6 months after the standoff, Dalton stood at his fence line at dawn, watching the sun rise over land that was finally, truly his. The barn had a new roof. The fields were green. The house had been repaired and painted. And in the pastures, horses grazed peacefully, their presence a living reminder of debts repaid and futures earned. Iona rode up as he stood there, her arrival unannounced but expected in the way family doesn't need to knock. She dismounted and stood beside him, both of them watching the morning light paint the valley gold. "My father died last winter," she said quietly. "Before he passed, he asked me to tell you something." Dalton looked at her, seeing grief held steady by strength. "He said he was wrong," Iona continued. "About mercy being weakness. About you being a fool. He said that watching what you built here, seeing how one choice in a blizzard changed everything." She paused, her voice catching slightly. "He said it reminded him that honor isn't about never needing help. It's about remembering help when you have the power to give it back. They stood in silence, and Dalton thought about Red Hawk's hard pride, about the bracelet left behind, about the years it took for some lessons to settle deep enough to change a man's heart. "I wish I could have told him I understood," Dalton said, "that I never expected anything. That saving Iona was enough." "He knew," she said simply. "That's why he asked me to tell you. So you'd know that the choice you made didn't just save one life. It changed how a proud man saw the world." She smiled, sad but genuine. "Some debts take generations to pay, Dalton. You're watching yours be honored by people you'll never meet, in ways you'll never fully see. That's what real legacy looks like." She mounted her horse and rode back toward the reservation, leaving Dalton alone with the mourning in the land and the understanding that 15 years ago he'd planted something in the dark without knowing if it would ever grow. And now he stood in the shade of what it had become, not just a saved life, but a bridge between peoples, a ranch reborn, a valley learning that mercy multiplied instead of depleting. He turned back to his work, to the fences that needed mending and the horses that needed tending, to the quiet daily labor of a man who'd learned that the choices no one sees are the ones that matter most. The red cloth snapped in the morning breeze, and Dalton smiled, knowing that somewhere in the valley, someone was telling the story again. The rancher and the wolves, the child and the chief, the scars that matched, the debt that grew in the dark until it became justice. And he hoped, as he walked back to his house, that someone hearing that story would remember it the next time they faced a choice between safety and mercy, between comfort and courage. Because one unseen act of kindness, given freely when the world was watching elsewhere, could echo across decades and reshape everything. That was the truth he'd lived, the truth that had saved him, and the truth worth sharing with anyone who still believed that honor mattered, even when, especially when, no one was there to see it. If you believe stories like this matter, if you believe that unseen kindness still has power, that honor echoes across time, and that one person's courage can change everything, then this channel is for you. Subscribe to hear more stories of frontier justice, debts repaid across decades, and the quiet heroes who reshape the world when no one's watching. Hit that notification bell, and let's keep these stories alive together.